Hello, it's Regina. Welcome back to my haunted library. So March is kind of rolling out like a lamb, which is nice because I'm ready for spring. Lily and I have been getting out for some lovely nature walks, but I'm ready for flowers to bloom. So March was kind of like, I was working a lot and was reading some, working on some different projects, writing projects, but I'm also like working at my other job. So but I did read 4 books, and usually I read more, but this one was kind of a bear. This is The Eye of the World by Robert Jordan, which is book 1 in the Wheel of Time high fantasy series. There are 14 books altogether, and a lot of people are doing like a read along with this right now, or I don't know if it's just happening now, if it's always been happening, but I've noticed that there's some activity on Twitter. Jason over at Jason's Weird Reads is doing a read along. And I was going to do an entire video just on this book, but as I was thinking about what I was going to say, I realized that I really didn't have any profound insights to add to this conversation that's already happening on podcasts. Like The White Tower has some really great podcasts I've been listening to. I feel like after completing this book, that this is one of those books that kind of, sort of like Lord of the Rings, requires additional study. And honestly, I'm not sure how much additional study I want to put into it because I have so many other books I want to read. But I did enjoy it, and I feel like I got everything. I mean, yes, there are a lot of concepts. I'm not sure I grasped all of those, but the general story I followed, it was very easy to follow. It kind of reminds me of almost like a young adult book because it's very tame in a way. The relationships are very, like young people, and some intrigue going on, some little romance, but a lot of large kind of philosophical concepts too, which I enjoyed. Again, I'm rambling because I really don't know what to say about this other than I liked it a lot. I'm on a fantasy kick, and I bought book 2. So I will continue at least a little while. And I found book 8, a nice hardback version of book 8 in a thrift store, and bought it. And it had the dust jacket, everything. I feel like that was a sign that I should go at least half of the series. So I don't know. It seems like if I bought all of this, it would be a lot of money. And I would have to have a whole fantasy wing in my library, which I'm starting to develop that. So, I'm not trying to like pressure myself to read these books. It's just like I'm going to keep going because I'm enjoying it. If I start to hate it or stop or want to take a break, I'm going to give myself that luxury. So after reading that, which was very dense, I decided, I just need a palate cleanser, some schlocky, silly horror book just to clear the air. And I found that with Disco Deathtrap by Cameron Roubique. This is a relatively new, came out a couple years ago, very much like tongue-in-cheek homage to the old 80s style paperbacks from hell, which I love, and a lot of people do. So I really enjoyed reading this. It was definitely a throwback to my old roller disco days, and I graduated from high school in 1980. That shows how ancient I am, but so I was right there with this time period. And I did hang out at the roller rink, and my mother was right about dating the boys that hung out at the roller rink because they were little rough trade, let's say, and but I kind of stayed out of trouble most of the time. And because this book has a like an old cemetery subplot, which is next to the roller rink, it kind of reminded me of one of my old high school boyfriends whose family owned a coffin factory next to the roller rink. No joke. And there were some stories about that maybe I'll share one day. But so this story is about a group of high schoolers. It's New Year's Eve. It's about to be 1980, so it's the end of the 70s. I remember I was in Times Square with my friends, very wasted at that time. And Times Square was very different. Like, it wasn't like it is now. It wasn't like security. It was just a bunch of drunk people wandering around in like a 1-block radius. But anyway, I digress. This was a group of high schoolers are literally like locked in the roller rink with like a chain padlock, which is a little bit of a stretch, but okay. So they can't get into trouble. And we're introduced to like a whole cast of characters. And there is a serial killer in the midst who is very reminiscent of the And the author puts this in the afterword, and I totally remembered this really scary trailer back in this time called Curtains. I never saw the movie, but I'll never forget the trailer with the guy skating on the ice with the axe with the mask coming at the girl. I should watch that movie because I've always been curious about it, but this is an homage to that in a way. And everything takes place with people on roller skates, which adds sort of a level of hilarity to it. So it didn't really scare me, but I was really impressed with some of the scenes I thought were really well done. This one scene where one of the girls is hiding from the killer and she's like in the bathroom stall, which is right straight out of Friday the 13th, I believe. And she sees like a guy who's been like injured, he's bleeding, like crawling towards her and making a streak. And I thought that scene was really well done. So so I enjoyed this. It was a quick, easy read. I will definitely check out this author's other works because, this isn't like earth-shattering, but it is fun. And horror fans, I think, will understand what I mean by that. Oh, and speaking of fun, just to throw this in, I got my latest copy of Weird Mask. Paperback Junkie, Matt at Paperback Junkie, does this cool zine. And I happen to have a story in this month's zine. And this is number 14. And I believe Steve Donahue does as well. Part 2. Yes, part 2 of his Sword and Sorcery story. Check it out. I wrote a very kind of like twisted story for this zine. So thanks, Matt, for including my story, and I'm looking forward to digging into this later today. So the next book I read is a nonfiction book called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette. This came out in like 91. It's a thin volume about male archetypes. It's a little bit like a self-help book for like that Iron John thing, which I was somewhat concerned when I was reading it because I was like, oh, this is going to be one of those. But I actually really enjoyed it. It gets into the different archetypes, for example, like the king archetype, and then its shadow self. It would be like the tyrant or the weakling king. And you'll see these in literature appear over and over again. And I think why, as a writer, this was useful to me and informative is it kind of makes you aware of that progress. And you can apply it to, like, the king archetype doesn't have to be like a medieval setting, like a King Arthur or like Lord of the Rings. It could be, a president of the United States. Could be a politician, a CEO of a corporation, a mob boss, like Don Corleone in The Godfather is a great example of the king archetype. And I remember reading or maybe it was seeing an interview with Francis Ford Coppola, and he said when he directed that story, of course, great movie, The Godfather, he thought of Don Corleone as having being they call in this book, like the fully realized king, the great man. He was a great man. He had all of these attributes that made him a great man. His sons are like the shadow of him, where the sons have each one of his abilities but are missing all of the whole piece. I thought that was a great way to kind of construct a story, to tell a story with those layers. And I think you're always want to be looking at those things. So that's the difference between like doing stereotyping and archetyping. The archetype has many different gradations and it's on a different scale. You can place these characters along these scales. You can have them progress from maybe tyrant king to learning to be a great king, or vice versa. You can have the king fall into tyranny or weakness. And you see a lot of these archetypes in fantasy, of course, but also in modern literature. And when I was reading about this, the magician is interesting. Like, I saw a lot of characters from like Game of Thrones and like Littlefinger, things like that. So this book has gotten some criticism on like Goodreads that it's very binary and it's old-fashioned concept of like masculine, feminine. And I can understand that, but I think that the book makes the point, although rather parenthetically, that these archetypes could be, any gender. So that is something to keep in mind. And I also believe that even though a lot of these archetypes are reinforced by our culture, they're not created by the culture. I really believe they are within us. They are instinctual patterns. And this is all based on like Jungian philosophy, which I really agree with most of it. Well, what I've read. I'm not saying I'm an expert, but it makes sense to me, and it rings true that these patterns are within us, and that is why we respond to them. That is why we respond to like the king, for good and for bad. The warrior. The warrior was also really good, and especially if you're writing like fantasy and you have a warrior character, or you're writing any kind of action piece, definitely worth looking at. And the lover too. All of these this was very informative. I highly recommend it. And next, I read December by Phil Rickman. This also came out in the early 90s. It's a horror book. I found it in the horror section of my secondhand bookstore, and I immediately was attracted to the premise. In the 12th century ruins of the Abbey, it is said every stone was cemented in blood. On December 8th, 1980, that blood will run again. So if you recognize that date, it was when John Lennon was murdered, and that does have a significance in this book. So the Abbey's tower house is now a recording studio, and a hot young band called the Philosopher's Stone has gathered to tap into the site's dark history. But no one could predict the powerful forces that rise the night of December 8th, the explosive tragedy, the horrifying death. And in the aftermath of that fateful session, the members of the band agree to destroy their tapes and never meet again. But 13 years later, the Abbey tapes, known as the Black Album, resurface, and the scattered members of the Philosopher's Stone know that it's time for a reunion, time to return to that dark December night for one last performance. Now, this was really good. It's really well written, but it's very long and it's kind of ponderous. Like, there are a lot of characters, and I got frustrated by that sometimes. Sometimes if it's like too many characters and I'm going with this guy and now we're switching to her and now we're back to this other guy, it gets a little, frustrating. So I do recommend, I give it 4 to 5 stars. I will definitely check out this author's work. He's a really good writer. It just kind of goes on a little bit. So I didn't love it, but I liked it a lot. So that is what I read for the month of March. Please let me know in the comments below if you read any of these books, and if you have any plans to read them, or if you know any good rock and roll horror books. I'm starting to put a playlist together for that, so any recommendations will be appreciated. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for stopping by my haunted library, and I'll see you soon.